Tonight we're going to start a 4-week series on questions for the Master. I think about if I could ask God anything, and I mean anything, and I knew that He would give me a verbal answer, what would I ask Him? Let me ask you that. If you knew, and I'm not saying we can't find the answer to our questions in God's book, but if you knew that God were going to pause right now, time and space, and say, okay, I'm going to let you ask me one question, what would your question be? You know, some I think would ask, which is the right religion? You know, some people, they're not sure why they follow what they follow, or they see all these different religious organizations out there, and they might say, well, why do I worship this way, or why do I do certain things this way? And they might ask, well, which is the right religion? Some might ask, well, why do people suffer? Why do people suffer? You know, that's one of the reasons, I mentioned Bart Ehrman this morning. He's a Bible scholar. He's also an atheist, and if you read his book, The Problem of Suffering, you realize that that's the reason why he became an atheist, and I've read it, and it's sad to hear about someone who truly has respect for God's Word while they don't respect the authority of it. And you can really read his pain and his tears as he discusses honestly why he can't trust in a living God. And it's sad, you know, and just thinking about the state of someone's soul like that. Someone might just ask, well, what are going to be the Powerball numbers next week? Or you know, who's going to win the national title tomorrow night and make a quick trip to Vegas and play some bets? I hope we would be a little bit deeper than that. I think about the 12 disciples, later the 12 apostles. I think about the 12 followers of Jesus. You know, these men, they were chosen by Jesus. Can you imagine being chosen by Jesus? They followed Jesus on trips. They went to cities. They went to villages. They saw Him heal. They heard His voice. There are many times where it was just Him and them. And there are many things that happen that you and I will never know on this side of eternity. Because when we read in John chapter 20 as well as John chapter 21, there are many things that occurred that are not written in this book. I wonder what those things were. Why did God choose and deliver this message to John to write down only the 21 chapters worth? These men asked questions all throughout His ministry. And I want to look at 4 of them. Tonight I want to look at the question of greatness. The question of greatness. How do I become great? See, because people are vying for greatness. They're striving to not just succeed, but to be someone special, someone important. Sometimes people they're striving for that high social status. You know, they want to be at the apex of their career. They want to have a high earnings and a high income, and they want to drive the best vehicles and have the best house, and it's primarily so they can have a higher social standing. That's why some people want to be great. Some people want to be great because they want to have the power of influence. They want to be the person that if you have a question or you have the problem, I have the ability to not only answer the question, but to have something handled for you. They like to dictate. They like to be in control. And that's why, man, if I could only do so many things, people would be coming to me. And in that way, I'd be great. And then I think of another group. I think some people just want to leave a legacy. And I'll be the first to admit, I've always wanted someday to go to a bookstore and see my name on the cover of a book. I think there would be something very surreal about that, and that was one of my dreams for the longest time, was to be an author. No matter if it sold 5 copies, just to say I wrote a book. And I think there's something, whether it's with our family, you know, we want to impart our wisdom to our children and grandchildren, or we want to have some sort of impact on society. We just want to matter. And we want to say that when we were gone, you know, people look back and say, wow, Jason Campbell, he was a great guy. Is it wrong to want to make an impact? You know, the apostles asked the same question, and they had a lot of conversation about greatness over the 3 years of Jesus' ministry. And in fact, we know of 3 specific times the apostles talked about greatness. They talked about on the road to Capernaum. That's what we're going to be looking at in just a minute. James and John had a very specific request for Jesus about being great. And then even at the Lord's Supper in the Gospel of Luke, we read the conversation turning to about greatness. However, what's sad about their conversation about greatness is you might say, they took their eye off the ball. And their focus of being a disciple was contradictory to Jesus' message. See, Jesus' life and His ministry and His message was about leaving greatness behind. See, Jesus came forth in a humble way to mankind. Jesus' ministry was all about rejection. Jesus' ministry was all about service. And what's so sad is when we look at the conversation of greatness with the disciples is they were looking to themselves to be great and they weren't looking to Jesus on how to truly be great. All the same, is it wrong to want to have a purpose that's successful? Is it wrong to want to leave a legacy? Is it wrong to want to make an impact? The question tonight, how do I become great? Truly great. First, we need to talk about competitive greatness. Competing for greatness. If you're not familiar with this picture, that's okay. This was, I believe it was the 2016 Tennessee-Georgia game. I was at a wedding with my wife. Then I believe my wife. I was having to do a couple years back, and so if you ask me more than a year, I'm kind of like, fiance, wife. This was October of 2016, so absolutely we were married for 2 months. And we were at a wedding with our friends, and with us was a couple, and they were married, and one was a die-hard Tennessee fan, and one was a die-hard Georgia fan. And we had spotty service. So every now and then, one of them go, ha! And it's because their team scored a touchdown. And it came down to the final seconds, and Georgia had won this game. I mean, it was over. I think it was 31-28. And they had a bet together about one washing the other one's car, when this game happened once a year. And boy, the wife was just all about how her team won. And man, Tennessee threw this Hail Mary. And in this picture, this snapshot, I think, defines competing for greatness. You have Georgia and Tennessee both going up for the ball. Tennessee came down with the ball. Tennessee won 34-31. Someone had to wash someone else's car that day. I think about greatness. What's interesting is maybe some of you didn't recognize that picture. Greatness is often fleeting. Yet we still compete for it. I think of Mark chapter 9. There's a silent discussion in verses 33 through 35. Look with me in verses 33 through 35. And they came to Capernaum, and when He was in the house, He asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent. For on the way they had, I don't know what your translation says, but the English Standard Version says, they argued with one another about who was the greatest. I want you to think about that for a minute. They were arguing. First of all, the disciples were hanging back. Did you catch that? Jesus said, "Hey, what were you guys talking about on the way?" That means, not that Jesus didn't know already, but they thought He didn't know. And He gave them an opportunity to fess up. Have you ever been in the car? Have you ever been in your house and your kids were talking about something? You said, "Hey, what are you guys talking about?" And they pipe back and say, "Nothing, nothing." And then they get quiet. I don't have kids, but I have worked with youth for 6 years, and typically that's not a good sign. If they're not willing to tell you something that they talked about. Here are the disciples. When Jesus asked them, they fell silent. Why? They knew, at least part of them knew, it was not a good discussion. They knew their master would not approve. they wanted to talk about not just what it means to be great, but they talked about who was the greatest among them. So I want us to keep our minds on context. I want you to think about context. At the beginning of Mark chapter 9, Jesus has the transfiguration on the mount, and Peter, James, and John are privy to this information. And when Jesus, he is transfigured, we have other individuals on the scene. We have other individuals appear in verse 4, both Elijah and Moses. And Jesus is conversing with them. And clearly, Peter was able to acknowledge and realize who these men were. And they were talking to Jesus as though he were an equal to them. It's not every day that your heroes of the Bible appear before you. And if they're talking to your teacher, he has to be someone great. I just can't imagine what it was like to be Peter or James or John. And you knew your teacher was someone special. I mean, he could even command the winds and the waves to be silent, to be still. But to talk with the heroes of faith and for them to talk to him on equal footing, it does make sense that they were interested in greatness. On the other hand, if you're in Mark chapter 9 and we're in verse 33, what did Jesus just finish discussing with them in verses 30 through 32? How he was going to die. How he's going to go to Jerusalem. How he's going to be delivered into the hands of men and they were going to kill him. Verse 32, but they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. See, they were so preoccupied with rank and standing in the kingdom of God. In fact, this kind of goes back with the Jewish thinking that the rabbis, the very special teachers, they were going to sit on thrones closer to God than even the angels would be. They were going to be someone special. They were going to be someone great. And the apostles were thinking, I want to be great too. And that's where we get to Mark chapter 10. One page over, more than likely in your Bibles. Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 37. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you. Now, parents, if your kids ever come up to you and say, would you do something for us without us telling you what we want you to do for us? If they look for your acceptance before they ask you the question, probably bad news. See, James and John were wanting a blank check from Jesus. They were saying, we want you to sign off on this before we tell you what it's about. Of course, Jesus, being Jesus, he said, what do you want from me? What do you want me to do for you? Here, verse 37. Midst of the apostles, midst of the 12, they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one on your left in your glory. I want you to think about being Peter in this situation. Being Thomas. Being Matthew. You are part of an elite unit chosen from all other individuals. And when your back is turned, two of your fellow compadres go to your master and ask to be the top dogs of the apostles. We know that this would upset the other 10 because in verse 41, and when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John, which means they were angry with James and John. And so I think we ought to pause here before we talk about what it means to be great, is when we think about greatness, we see that the searching and the questions and the desire to be great eventually led to division. And these 10 were mad, more than likely, not just because the others would have the gall to ask Jesus this question, but because it's something they wanted to. And James and John beat them to the punch. In fact, in Matthew's account, they use their poor mama to ask Jesus the question. Yet Jesus directs the question, the answers back to them rather than the mom. So before we continue and answer the question, how do I become great? What does it mean to be great? Here's some thoughts for reflection. Why do you want to be great? I mean, dig down into your heart and truly think, why? Why? Second, when you think about greatness, is my desire to be great something good or something bad? And how do you know? Well, it's the same reason why the apostles, when Jesus asked what they were talking about, they fell silent. Same reason that after James and John had discussion with Jesus, it caused division. And that's the third thought. Will my thirst for greatness cause division with my loved ones? Okay. The question has been asked, and you've been waiting there, thinking, okay, is he ever going to talk about the answer? How do I become great? Well, yes, we will. And yes, I am. Here's an answer given. Going back to Mark chapter 10. We're actually going to start in chapter 10 and then go back to chapter 9. What's so wonderful about the questions asked Jesus, he typically, and this is what a good teacher does, by the way, he asked a question in return. In fact, he asked multiple questions in return. Look in verse 38. Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking." These little kids just wanted something great. And he said, "You don't even understand what you're talking about. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they, being eager, shouted out, "Yep, yes we are, we're ready." Just like when Peter was told that he was going to deny Jesus, he said, "Lord, I'll never do that." They didn't even think about it. They said, "Sure." Jesus, when he said, "Are you willing to drink from the cup with which I'm about to drink?" We talked about before in sermons, the cup, same cup Jesus asked God to pass from him in the garden, referred to the wrath of God. The baptism, it's not water baptism. The word baptism, in essence, means to submerge or immerse. And here it meant suffering. Jesus was going to be rejected. He was going to suffer. And he was going to take the wrath of God for mankind. Jesus said, "You don't know what you're talking about when you want to sit next to me, when you want to be really close to me, because what I'm about to go through, you don't have any clue." They said, "Yep, we're able." Jesus said to him, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized." Not saying necessarily they would suffer the wrath of God, but they would suffer wrath. And with the baptism, they would also face rejection. They would also face suffering. It's interesting that James was the first one of the 12, not including Judas, but with Matthias, he was the first one martyred, beheaded in Acts chapter 12. Of the 12, we see Stephen first in Acts 7. John would be the last one to die of the 12, but he would suffer rejection, heartache. He would see his closest friends, his brother, killed at the hands of people who didn't want anything to do with God. Jesus said, "Oh yes, you're going to be baptized with it. It's not my place to give you, though." Jesus, in essence, is saying, have you counted the cost of what it means to follow me? Don't be so eager for greatness that you don't realize what it's going to cost you. In fact, that's what our bulletin article this morning was about priorities of following Jesus. He then said in Mark chapter 9, He gathered a child and said, if anyone would be first, he must be last and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And a lot of people think of this passage, they think, oh, we're supposed to be like little kids. We're supposed to have wonder and excitement and awe in everything we do. That's not what Jesus is referring to here. A child in the first century was the most insignificant creature on earth. We adore children today, and I'm glad we do. But in the first century, the death rate was so high that they didn't have a status. Even the Jewish parents who loved their children and showed love and care to them, the children did not have a status until they grew up, until they could do something worth purpose. They were dependent upon others. They needed things. Jesus said, you have to not only be insignificant, but you have to receive even the lowest of the low in my name. You can't be so quick looking for greatness and rubbing your elbows. You're spending all your time with those who are wealthy, those who are wise, those who are rich. You're to serve on this earth. And if you do that, you'll be greatest of all. You'll be like me. How do I be great? What's the answer? I want to turn your attention to one more person. The lesson is yours. John chapter 3. John chapter 3. Beginning at verse 25. See, here's a point. John has been on the scene. We call him John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, John the Immerser. He's been preaching, kingdom of heaven's at hand. Make the path straight. Here comes God. Jesus comes on the scene. And Jesus and his disciples, they begin baptizing at the countryside. Well, John was also baptizing, verse 23. This is before John was put in prison. A discussion arose, and they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who is with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all, not some, not a lot, not most, all are going to him. Where are your disciples? Where is your following? John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. John here says, friends, I serve my purpose, and I rejoice that Christ is getting the glory. We look for greatness, but we realize greatness is only found in rejoicing in the glory of Jesus Christ. Any other type of greatness, whether it's money, influence, or even a legacy, is temporary. Jesus is forever. And in Him, we find purpose. In Him, we find legacy. In Him, we find greater joy than anyone in this world could ever know. How do I achieve greatness? It's by living and doing and serving in the lifestyle that John spoke of. John 3, verse 30. He must increase, but I must decrease. If I want to be great, if I want to have a lasting effect on this world, I must decrease, and I let Jesus increase. Searching for greatness. Greatness can only be found in Jesus Christ. Because in the end, who am I truly trying to please? Do I want to try to find a moment that I can obtain that might last for just a few minutes, maybe even a century or two, before my name is forgotten amongst the many other names that have been forgotten over history? Or do I want my name to be written in the book of life, which will never be erased? That on some day when God appears, when Jesus is seen in the heavens, I know that my name is with Him. And I know that He will be calling me home. And I will truly then understand the greatness of God. And I'll be a part of it. Do you want that kind of greatness? To be part of the family of God. Not for yourself, but for Him to have the glory. If there's anything you need tonight, any thoughts on your minds, any doubts you're concerned with, any sins that you're battling, temptations you're struggling, any burdens you want to lay down at Jesus' feet, don't hold back. Decrease. Let God increase. Come now while we stand and while we sing.